everyone to the Audit Committee Practices Report webinar. I'm Vanessa Teitelbaum. I'm a Senior Director at the CAQ in Professional Practice. And we are delighted today, I am delighted today to be talking to you about our report. And we have some great panelists today. Krista Parsons from Deloitte, Karen Golz, and Tony Anderson. Karen and Tony are on the CAQ's Audit Committee Practices Report. Audit Committee Council. And so you can see their bios. To start off, we want to launch our first polling question. And that is, what are the top priorities for your organization? And that's the subject of our webinar today. And we're going to talk through the results of our report. So we're curious, for those of you who have joined us, how the results of our survey match up with what's on your mind. So we'll come back to that polling question. It'll see the results after we have our discussion. But to start off, we want to talk about the survey that we conducted in the fall of last year. So it was September through October of 2024. We had 237 participants, and we had primarily, of those participants, we had 86% who were public companies, 89% were in the US. The majority were non-financial, but we did have 27% financial services, and that becomes important when we get into some of our discussion on ERM, because as you know, financial service companies have risk committees, and so that affects whether the audit committee has the primary oversight of certain topics. We also asked whether participants were audit committee chairs or members. We had a little bit more than a half, 57%. Are chairs, and the majority of our respondents are large cap. So 36% more than 10 billion, 36% 2 billion to 10 billion in market cap, 21% small cap being 250 million to less than 2 billion, and 6% being what we call micro cap. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Krista. Krista, we don't have the slide right now. But you can look up our Audit Committee Practices Report. It was co-authored by the CAQ and the Deloitte Center for Board Effectiveness. And so Krista's going to talk us through the top priorities.
Sounds great, Vanessa. Thank you. And it's always fun to do this webcast, which has now become an annual event. And we have Karen and Tony back again, which is always fun. So really enjoy doing this with Vanessa and the CAQ team. So just as far as the genesis of the report goes, as I work with audit committees and meet with them, a couple questions that I get a lot are, what are other audit committees focused on, and what are other audit committees doing? And benchmarking of that type of information isn't always readily available. So as we work with the CAQ over the past several years, we decided that we wanted to try and fill that gap. And as we thought about how could we do that, we created the survey that underpins the Audit Committee Practices Report. So now in our fourth year, we have more trend data, which is what we're going to talk about today. So as Vanessa said, you can take a look at the report. We'll get the slides up whenever we can. But as you dive into the report, the first section of the report, which is what we're going to focus on today, really talks about the priorities of the audit committee. And so when we start out the survey, we ask all of the respondents to identify what areas, we provide them a list of topics and ask what areas do the audit committee have oversight for versus the board or other committees. And using that as a starting point for any area that the audit committee has oversight for, we then ask them some specific questions about those areas. One, which is what we're really going to focus on today, is what are those top 3 priorities that you have as an audit committee over the next 12 months? And this is done outside of financial reporting and internal controls, because we would like to think that most audit committees would put financial reporting and internal controls really at the top of that list. So now you can see on the slide what the results were of that survey. And it's pretty overwhelming response as far as what those top 3 priorities were. Now, the top 3 are consistent with what we saw last year, but it is worth noting that even though the top 3, cybersecurity, enterprise risk management, and finance and internal audit talent, are the same top 3 priorities as last year, it was a larger consensus. So a higher percentage of audit committees picked those as the top 3 this year than they did last year. So you can see overwhelmingly 93% of the respondents picked cyber as a top 3 risk, with 50% picking it as the #1 risk that they will be focusing on over the next year. Enterprise risk management, we had 76% that included it in the top 3, with a third in saying that it was #1. And then for finance and internal audit talent, 65% put that in the top 3, with a quarter of the respondents putting it as the #1 area that they would be focusing on over the next year. If we can flip to the next slide, I wanted to just show a comparison of what we had as the results for this year and the next year and last year. So you can see here on the left is the order of the responses this year, and then on the right are those from last year, and you can see the changes. So in the middle is where you see some of the differences. And as you see some of the shifts, some of these may be surprising if you think about the focus today. Areas like ESG, areas like compliance, those moved up. It is worth repeating what Vanessa said at the beginning, that the survey was out in the market from September 16th to October 11th of last year. So pre-election, pre some of the priorities that have been identified by the current administration, especially on the ESG and the regulatory front. So if you had asked some of these questions today, I think we might have slightly different reordering in the middle of the line here. The other thing I would just highlight again that Vanessa mentioned is the differences in the industry. So everything we're going to cover today is focused on the total responses, so across industry. But we did ask a qualifying question around specifically financial services or not. And I wanted to highlight 2 big differences that you would see if you are with a financial services organization. One is that ERM for financial services organizations drops down to #7. As a priority, which is not surprising, given, as Vanessa mentioned, that banks of a certain size are required to have a risk committee. So the audit committee often doesn't have oversight for that area. The other one that changed was compliance. And so that one moved up to #3. Also not surprising, just given the regulatory environment that banks operate in. So that's a quick overview, Vanessa, of the top priorities. So I'll turn it back to you and we can take a look at the response of the polling question.
Thank you. Sounds good. We're going to go through, do a deep dive of each of the top 3. We are going to get to some of those other priorities. I see we already have a question in the Q&A, which is great. Keep questions coming. We are going to get to them, as many as we can. But for the one on AI, we're going to ask you to hold that thought for a moment. We'll get to that a little bit later. And let's share the results of the first polling question. So 32% say cyber. I think we launched this poll before the answers from our survey came out. And then ERM, and then finance and internal audit talent. So that's like right in line with our survey results. We are going to talk more about compliance laws and regs and finance. I mean, they're all important. And I think some of them are also, as we'll talk more, interconnected. Okay, so keep an eye on the polling questions. We're going to have 4, and you do need to complete them all to get your CPE credit. So now let's go to the next slide. I want to say it is slide 8. And this is cybersecurity. So what we wanted to highlight here, and then we're going to get our experts talking to our experts, Karen and Tony, in addition to Krista. This is showing what I like about so for all of our topics, we asked who has primary oversight. And so for here, you can see with cyber, 62% say the audit committee. You'll see that we, oops, sorry, I lost my video there for some reason. We, okay, there we go. Sorry. You'll see with ERM that'll be a little bit less, but a big portion, if not the audit committee, is the full board. And you'll also see here 71% have cyber on the agenda quarterly, which is one of the highest response rates among these various topics. And as Krista said, just as a reminder, all of these priorities are above and beyond financial statement and ICFR oversight. We know from our first survey that that's the very #1 priority. So this is like on top of that. So with this as a background, Karen, can you talk about cyber from your perspective the risk landscape. This is, like Krista said, not the first time cyber has been at the top of the list. So what is changing, if anything? Why is this continuing to be a top priority for boards and audit committees?
First, thanks for having me today. It's great to be with everyone. And thanks to the CAQ and Deloitte for undertaking the survey and sharing this very insightful report. I think the landscape related to cybersecurity risks has only gotten more dangerous and more all-pervasive. There's a sense that it's accelerating, so at an even faster pace than it has been. The threat actors, whether they're nation states, criminal groups, think ransomware as a service, and insider threats. Don't forget insider threats, because they can likewise have challenges. These threat actors and the vectors, or the means by which they attack, have increased dramatically in sophistication and reach. Some do this for financial gain. Some do it for ideological reasons or ideological gains. And of course, insiders could do it for because they're just unhappy with something that's happened in the organization. So on my audit committees, we do consider cyber among the top risks because of the extent and the persistence of these threats. And it's not if you're going to get attacked, it's when. So anybody who thinks they're not going to get attacked is fooling themselves, and that's not a good place to be, given how persistent. There's people who are, this is what they get up and do every day, try to attack companies. And so my own experience is aligned with it being in the sort of the top priority. And it's because of the damage, right? The damage that it can inflict on the company. It's not just the financial damage, it's the reputational damage, it's the being offline, the kind of what I call kill the company or severely injure the company risks. And so you want to have those front and center. And so in my audit committees, we do quarterly. So I aligned with that last slide you presented. And we also are focused on how the company should be improving its cyber posture, using cyber posture and maturity, using an accepted framework. And in my organizations, we use the NIST framework as the framework by which we will try to measure that. But I would add one other thought, and that's depending on what your companies do, you may need to think about cyber, not just about your corporate systems, but about your products, your company's products, because they are exposed to cyber risks and vulnerabilities. And the reason I bring it up is because oftentimes product security is not in the hands of your CISO. It may be, but oftentimes it's not. It's in the hands of the chief product or development officer, or they may have their own CISO who reports to the CTO. And those folks are oftentimes, traditionally not getting into the scope of getting into the audit committee. They're not accustomed to coming before the audit committee and saying, how are we addressing this, this, and this? So I have found that on some of the organizations that I chair, you have to be very intentional to make sure you're getting the product security people and the corporate security people aligned and kind of going in the same path.
Yeah, thank you. Tony, want to come to you. What changes, if any, have you seen on your boards related to cyber? Are you seeing more frequent discussions in terms of the agenda? You seeing different interactions with levels of management, the tabletop exercises, that kind of thing? And you're on mute. Tony, you're on mute, yeah.
Thank you, Vanessa, and listen to everybody who's on. Welcome. So glad that you're able to join us. This cyber area has become so complex, and I couldn't agree more with what Karen shared with the group. We are doing more at our audit committees, at least the ones I'm on, and do we do it quarterly? No, but we certainly engage on this topic probably 2 or 3 times a year, and they're pretty detailed, and so so we spend a lot of time talking about it and having the right people in the room to discuss it. The other thing that we've done is we talk about it at the full board meeting. And so while we do deep dives on various areas around cyber at the audit committee, it's just, we feel that the full board ought to be engaged on this topic, given just how important this has become. And so that's probably the major change, I think, is the frequency, the engagement at the board level, and like. One of the things I would highlight when you think about this, and it's easy to get involved in talking about some of the technicalities around cyber, but I just want to highlight the importance of making sure, you know, companies have covered the basics. So things like access controls or patching or all those kinds of things that, you know, what I have found, most people find those things to be a bit of a nuisance, but they are really important to have in place. And so one of the things I would share with the group is don't lose sight of it. And certainly, you know, you think about something like access controls, listen, it's not the sexiest thing to talk about, but enormously important. And then you get into things like, you know, controls around directories and the like. Those have to be, you know, really up to date and well controlled. So, you know, I would add that to the discussion and make sure people don't overlook it.
Yeah. Karen, Tony mentioned having the right people in the room. Can you talk a little bit about how you ensure your committee, the audit committee, but perhaps it's the full board, has the necessary expertise? I think it's come up on this webinar before in a lot of forums that I'm at, this notion of having, you know, a specific expert on the committee or the board, and sort of pros and cons to that. So how do you make sure you have the right level of expertise?
Yeah, I think on, you know, an audit committee, let's say it's 3 or 4 people, right? So, and of course, it's a bit tricky because to consider the makeup, because the traditional makeup and focus of audit committees has, you know, has requirements from the SEC and the listing bodies, right? So you have certain kinds of skills that must be present by statute and law. But that said, just like I think audit committees' missions or what they're doing has expanded, I think then that calls you as a committee to say, do we need to expand our skill sets, and can we do it? You know, how do we do that? And so on a couple of my audit committees, I have, as chair, proactively asked the nominating governance committee to get me somebody with certain kinds of skills, and I've looked for cyber, I've looked for IT. You know, because it may be you don't necessarily just want solely a cyber, but you want somebody who can operate in that space and can move back and forth. So we've thought about risk, we've thought about IT, cyber, technology background, and I'll just give you an example. In one case, we had the former recently retired chief technology officer from a large aerospace and defense company join the audit committee. We had responsibility for risk, and that included, and it happened to include both product and corporate types of risks like cyber. So it was a great add. And another one, we added a very well-known, a renowned academic who was steeped in technology. And he of course was a little bit scared when I said I wanted to join the audit committee because he's like, oh, but he happened to chair, he's the head of a very, very large college of computing at a major institution. And I told him, well, you know, being the dean, that's like being the CEO, right, of this big organization. And you have internal audit, and and you have to do budgets. And he said, oh, yeah, that's right, I do all that. So, you know, he was a little nervous coming on at first, but a tremendous ad. And you have to think outside the box, I think, if you're going to have such a broad remit. But you also have to try to find people who can make sure that they can contribute to the basic functioning of the audit committee. You know, the financial statements, the internal controls, all the work of the internal auditor and external auditor, but can contribute mightily, actually, on these other topics.
Hey, Vanessa, I was just going to add, like, I couldn't agree with Karen more. You need the basic core responsibilities of the audit committee in addition to some of these other skills. But if you even go back to the Audit Committee Practices Report, we did ask a question about if you needed additional skills on your audit committee. And we broke up cyber and technology because they are different. You know, technology is so much broader and it covers so much more. But those were the top two areas by far. 50% of the people said they would like additional cyber skills on their committee, and 48% said technology. And the next one was 27%. So definitely skills that are in demand on audit committees today.
Yeah, I just
Yeah,
said
and I
one
was
last thing, one
go
quick
ahead.
last thing.
Yeah,
You know,
please.
as chair of the audit committee, I felt like I needed to do something to make myself smarter. I always reserve the right to get smarter. And so I took the NACD Cyber certification course, which is about 20 hours of coursework, I might add. But it was very enlightening, and I think it's allowing me to ask better questions because I've been through that. So invest in
great.
yourself too.
Right. Krista, I was going to ask you also, one of the things that I know you talk to or hear from board members a lot, the question often comes up, should we have a tech committee? Should we have a cyber committee? Should we have a subcommittee? And I've heard a lot of different responses to that, but you know, what do you hear when you're asked that question?
Yeah, you won't like my answer because it's going to be, it depends.
I know, it depends.
It depends. Yeah, I mean, it completely depends on the strategy of your company. It depends on the makeup of your board, because you can't, you know, if you have a small board and you have 4, 5, 6 committees, you're spending all of your time in board meetings and then on, you know, 3 or 4 committees in order to be able to cover them all. So you really need to think about the strategy of your organization, and then how that committee structure is set up and how you have board members to fill that. Now, one thing I've heard, and I don't advocate, like I said, for or against, I do think it depends on the company. One thing I have heard some people talk about, if you do decide you need a technology committee or a cyber committee, whatever you want to call it, one benefit that can provide is that if you think about cyber on under the audit committee, often what the audit committee will focus on is the risk side. You're looking at just the risk piece of it. Where if you have a separate committee focused on technology or something broader, you may be able to look at the risk and the opportunity a little bit better. Theoretically, that should be covered by the board or whatever other other committee would cover technology if you have the audit committee covering cyber. But that's just one thing to think about. One other structure I have seen a little bit, not pervasive, but I've seen a couple companies, if cyber is something that just really does need a little bit more focus, but they don't feel like they either have the people or the ability to create or the need to create a new committee, is I have seen some companies set up a subcommittee of an audit committee that does focus on cyber for a period of time. And then that committee meets, reports up to the audit committee, but then at some point that would just be rolled into the audit committee. So sorry to say, it does depend based upon the organization.
Karen, we have a question in the Q&A asking what the name of the cyber course was. I know you said it's NACD.
Yeah, it's called it's NACD. It's called Cyber Cert, CERT certification, and it's delivered by Carnegie Mellon Software. What the heck is it called? Software something Institute.
Okay.
Yeah, but
We
you'll
should
see
find
it
a link
prominently on the
and,
NACD website.
follow
It's
up.
very prominent.
Okay. You said Carnegie Mellon.
Carnegie Mellon Software Institute.
Okay. All right, let's launch our second polling question while there we go. This is, so for your organization, who has primary oversight of cyber from a board perspective? What committee? And we're going to give that a minute, and we'll show those results later. So now let's shift gears to the second priority that we had, and that is enterprise risk management. And so if we can share the slide, there we go. So same breakdown here. Now you'll notice who has primary oversight of our respondents. The audit committee is 52%, and that's somewhat down from the 62% we saw on cyber. A little bit higher for the full board on this one. But the big difference in what I noticed is that a pretty sizable amount, 19%, is risk committees, and that's different from the cyber. And so that to me makes sense. I think it could be reflective of the fact that we had, if you remember, 27% of our respondents are in financial services. And so ERM is being slotted under risk committee more often than cyber appears to be. In terms of how often is it discussed, 49% say quarterly, and that's down from the 71% we saw for cyber. So not as frequent. And we can stop sharing this one now, if that's okay. And now we'll go to Krista. When you think about ERM, one of the things right now it's hard to ignore is regulatory changes. So as the regulatory landscape, it always shifts, but it's quite drastic right now. How do audit committees stay informed, and prepare for keep abreast of everything that's changing?
Yeah, so I'll focus on just maybe the areas that are most relevant to the audit committee, because otherwise I think I could probably fill the rest of the hour if we just talk about broader regulatory changes. But maybe thinking about SEC, PCAOB, and maybe just one other area that impacts that. But if you think about, as you said, Vanessa, the regulatory environment, extremely dynamic right now in the new administration. I think there have been over 100 executive orders that have been signed in the first couple of months. And so it is challenging for companies to keep up with that. So trying to stay apprised of that, leveraging your counsel, leveraging your auditors to the extent that you can, I think is something that you should do. When we think about those that do specifically align to the audit committee, as I mentioned, the SEC is one that is important to focus on. So one, Paul Atkins was named nominated as the SEC chair, and he had his first hearing March 27th, and he's expected to be confirmed later this month. And during his first confirmation hearing, some of the things that he had said he would be focused on as the SEC chair, one was focusing on crypto regulation and bringing some clarity around that. Even before he had this hearing, Mark Uyeda, who is the acting chair, had already formed a crypto task force. They've already been doing some work in that area. So we do think that there will be a big focus on crypto. And I'll tell you, even clients I have that had been in crypto, got out of it, they are already very, very actively talking about this. I think there's a lot of attention in this area. The other thing he focused on was regulations around capital formation. So making sure that there's clear rules of the road to benefit all market participants that are within the regulator's statutory authority. Another area of focus is maybe less focus is the SEC's vote to end the defense of the climate disclosure rules. So that happened a couple of weeks ago, if I have my timing correct. The thing I would just say here, just to caution you, while the SEC may not be moving forward with this, just keep in mind there still are other rules out there that you may need to comply with. The EU still does have some rules, even though they are a little bit lighter than what they were with some recent changes there. And also California and some other states do have some rules. So just make sure you understand what you are specifically responsible for as an organization. And then the other thing he mentioned was looking at ways to ease the regulatory burden on small companies and the IPO process. So that's an area. And then finally, just disclosures. I think there will be a return to making sure that disclosures truly do help investors understand risk and probably trying to pare those down a bit. So that's the SEC. The other organization that always kind of gets paired with that is the PCAOB. Which is the regulator of the audit industry. And so the PCAOB is not a government agency, so they are not directly impacted by these changes, but the SEC oversees them. So we do expect that there may be some changes under Atkins, but that is to be seen once he does officially take that role. The last thing I would mention here that I do think has gotten a lot of attention, or maybe a little attention, but maybe it should get a little more, is the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So there was an executive order that paused the Justice Department's enforcement of FCPA. And what I would highlight here for audit committees is to just make sure that you appreciate that it doesn't change the rules of the FCPA. Those are still in effect. What this EO does is just suspend the DOJ's enforcement of it. And so they'll be looking at, they're not going to be doing new investigations. They won't be pursuing existing ones for a period of time as the Attorney General takes a look at what enforcement will look like. But the FCPA does remain in effect. And so audit committees should not take their pressure off of that. They should really keep an eye on that and look at it. So those are just a few of the areas that we think will be impacted. But really, it's important for audit committees just to lean in, understand from management, as I mentioned, your external auditors should have a really good pulse on this, understand from them what's happening, what's changing, and then how management is looking at this, and then how your internal audit is also considering these as they think about the impacts it may have on your organization.
Thanks. Tony, Krista identified a lot of, changes that are happening. We're very familiar at the CAQ and many of you with the regulatory changes, but emerging risks are not new. I mean, arguably a lot of us got surprised by the pandemic. Maybe some people didn't. I did. And other risks, right? Some you can anticipate, some you can't. So when you think about the enterprise risk management of the companies for the boards that you're on, how is the audit committee collaborating, with management? How are they identifying emerging risk, and how do you keep the ERM program dynamic and responsive?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. It's interesting because one of my boards, it's really a nice thing that we do, right? I mean, every year we have literally a survey that's done at a board meeting around what the top risks are going to be for the company. And so management does it, the board does it, we schedule them out, we prioritize them, and we actually assign them to individuals at the company to address them and manage them. I think it's a great process, because there's a good level of collaboration between all of the board members and management about why certain risks are what they are. And if they're not as significant, then understand why the company believes that. The other thing that comes up is you wind up getting some really good input from the board. And I'll give you just a quick example to show how it emerged. I mean, we were doing this was a couple of years ago, but we were working on it. And one of the things that was not on there was geopolitical risk. And there's a lady on the board who, said, how can this possibly not be on your list of things? Now, this is a global company, right? They operate all over the world in 140 countries. And how could it not be on the list? And it actually changed. It changed the risk that had been identified. It was added. It all of a sudden got a fair amount of prominence by the company, and so it's a really good exercise. And so I'm not sure I'm sure everybody does it a little different, but the collaboration was particularly striking to me. So that's how we do it. And then those that really impact the audit committee, we'll take those on at the audit committee. So you take something like, compliance. Well, compliance is a real big deal to us, and we spend a fair amount of time on it. And while it's not sexy, it's a big deal. And FCPA, I know there's a lot of noise about it, but it continues to be important. And in some ways, I think about it in the context of, what value system does the company have? And so, there are a lot of reasons to stay very active and engaged on this topic and make sure that the right things are happening in the organization. And so that's how we get at it, Vanessa. And it seems to work.
Awesome. Karen, I know we talked about this a little bit in prep, and both Krista and Tony have mentioned it, right? The FCPA, this announcement that there's going to be a suspension, but in planning for this, we talked a little bit about, how do you handle this flip-flop that's happening in the administration. So right now, and of course we're all saying don't take your foot off the gas, but how do you think about the ERM and compliance when there's a different focus from the administration, 1 4-year period, compared to another?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. I think, and Tony touched on this in his comments. I think, certainly we're all many of us are citizens of this country or other countries, and we have to pay attention to whatever country's administration is doing, but we have to anchor what we do in the values of the company. you know, the values and the business of the company. And FCPA is a good example. None of the companies I'm on the board of, you know, are going to stop paying attention to whether we're complying with the FCPA because it's the law. And it's consistent with our values. We don't want to undertake things that cause that. Now, Tony also touched when he said ERM's not, I think he said it's not the sexiest thing. You know, I like to say it's not the most popular portfolio of things in a company. No CEO says, please give me more enterprise risk management people, or, you know, please let me stock up the board with a bunch of people like that. They all want, you know, they want people with strategy or growth or other kinds of things. But of course, you know, we all know that things will happen, right? There will be unfortunate things that happen, risks that manifest themselves in bigger or smaller ways. So I think it's important to have really back to this mix of skills, right? The mix of skills that's on the board or on the audit committee. It'd be great if you can have somebody who's overseen risk management or enterprise risk management. It doesn't have to have been their most immediate job, but if they have it in the past. But then you also look at, you know, again, what I call, you know, people with really broad professional career expertise. Take a public company CFO. All the public company CFOs I know, they usually have very strong business, very strong operational, very strong accounting, and they have very good what could go wrong instincts because they have to try to play out what could go wrong this quarter, this year, and so forth that would keep us from meeting our Wall Street's expectations, right? These are excellent set of skills. So they don't necessarily haven't been the ERM person, but they've got this really wide aperture. Also a COO or a CEO, they have similar range and reach along this. A COO thinks more along operational things. How do we make sure we're complying with health and safety regulations? How do we make sure we're, you know, doing this or that, export control, those kinds of things. And I think when you get people like that, whether it's on your audit committee or on your board, what they can help do is make sure the company's enterprise risk function is focused on the right things. You know, I think you want a function that's dynamic, not static. To Tony's point about getting input from, you know, others, you know, about what you don't want it to be. Oh, I checked all the boxes, right?
That's right.
We don't want to have an enterprise risk register that has 50 risks on it. How do you think about those? That's not the way. And so I think people on the audit committee or on the board can help the enterprise risk function in a company be more meaningful by helping them focus, which I think is what Tony's, when he talked about the process with one of his, it was to bring more focus. The question about geopolitical, I mean, how could you not have that on there? But if you've got
maybe lost
I think we just lost her.
That's okay. I'm sure she's going to come back to us if her internet is like mine.
Hey, I'm sorry, before you do that,
please.
one other thing that we haven't talked about, whether it was around cyber or around ERM, that's probably important to mention, is the involvement of internal audit. You know, the reality is there's a lot of talent there, and them being involved in and looking at some of this stuff is huge. And so a lot of this really touches on how they put together their program for the year. You know, so if you're coming up with an ERM process and you have all these key risks, it is interesting to see how it dovetails with what the plan is for internal audit. This is the same thing with cyber. You know, and you know, one of my companies, I mean, internal audit was highly engaged in evaluating the quality of what the company does around cyber, and in fact was really instrumental in making sure one of the companies was really looking at the basics, because they had kind of gotten a little bit, you know, stale. And so I just want to make sure we don't overlook the importance of internal audit when you're looking at all these different things. And so I think Karen's right. CEO, COO, CFO, all these people bring a lot of talent to the table. Internal audit sits back and says, okay, you know, that's the risk element or risk side of this thing that I think could be really informative for the audit committee and for the board to get their perspective on these things. And so let's just not overlook this point. Sorry.
That's great. It's a perfect segue. Karen, we're glad you're back. Let's launch the poll results. from our last polling question, so we do find, for this one is for cyber, for this audience, 39% has the audit committee and 22% risk committees, and then a good 20% full board. Let's close this out and let's launch our next polling question. Again, making sure that everybody has, can get their CPE. So this next polling question, same one, and now we're curious who has oversight of ERM. So while you answer that, we're going to go right into our next section, which is the third priority of our report, and that is just what Tony was talking about, talent. And so specifically, right, finance and internal audit talent. And so here you see the highest percentage of oversight by the audit committee of the top 3 priorities, 92%, with just a smaller amount being the full board and barely any other committees having oversight. And then this follows in terms of being on the agenda, audit committee agenda. 38% is the least frequent of the top 3 priorities. But we can close this out for now, or stop sharing the slides for now. And then we'll continue this conversation, Tony, that you were just talking about. So sorry, let me just find my notes on this section. So we're going to start with Karen. What are the strategies that your companies, I know you're on several boards, employ to attract and retain top talent in finance and internal audit, and especially considering the rapid advances in technology?
Thanks. Sorry, my internet cut out. I start by saying that, finance and internal audit talent are in short supply these days, highly sought after. And this is especially true post the pandemic because we lost a lot of people, kind of stepped down, retired, whatever. So, success begets success. So I think the best things the company can do to both attract and retain top talent is, one, have a very strong and successful company that people want to be part of, right? That has values that they align to. Create a positive environment for successful individuals so they can thrive, but create opportunity for further learning, growth, and development, and experimentation. Give some space for experimentation for people to develop, especially around new technologies like artificial intelligence, automated control operations, and other technology advancements. Also, both finance and internal audit professionals benefit from rotational assignments where that help them grow and highlight and further develop their capabilities. I can give you an example. In one of my companies, there was a super talented finance professional. She was literally buried many layers down in some business unit. And we happened to have a very astute CFO who spotted her and convinced her to take a role outside her comfort zone in treasury. And it was transformational, absolutely transformational. She had worked for the company for like 15 years and nobody knew who she was. And once he spotted her and she got out there and what great potential and talent she was, once that light got shown on her, she's now leading a whole nother transformation effort in the organization. But I think spotting the talent and giving them a chance is
good on her for taking the leap.
Yeah, and you got to be willing to take the leap, but somebody's got to give you some cover, right? Because if you stumble, you don't want to get fired.
Yep. Tony, how about, from your perspective, what is the audit committee's role? I mean, Karen had a great example where somebody spotted the talent, but what is the audit committee? How can the audit committee contribute, play a role with finance, attracting, retaining talent?
I'll say it, on the outset, there's a difference between management and the board. And so I think it's important that board members don't try and step into the seat or in the shoes of management.
Fair.
With that said, there are things you can do. And so, for example, I meet with the audit committee, or not the audit committee, with the internal audit group. And, it's an interesting discussion, right? Because I've set an environment or culture of the committee of really open dialogue on any issue, okay, without any fear of anybody being thrown under the bus. And I think that level of engagement has kind of filtered down to a broader group within internal audit. And so I meet with them literally once a year. I do the same thing with the finance team. And it gives us an opportunity, the committee, an opportunity to engage on some of the things that are really important to us, and what they do and how important it is to how we execute our responsibilities. So I think engaging with that broader group is important because, to a little bit to Karen's point, I mean, you wind up identifying some people and say, oh my God, what are you doing with this person? I mean, he or she is, they were pretty impressive in that room, and get people talking about it a bit. And so I think, as opposed to just having people come to the meeting and cover their area, meeting with the broader team and engaging with them and talking with them. And literally I set it up, and I said, like, okay, I'm here, we're going to talk, here's my agenda, here's some of the things I want to talk about. Let's sit down and talk about what are the things on your mind. And the way I tee it up sometimes is I'll say, we're together for 90 minutes. And so what are we going to talk about that's going to make you walk out of this meeting after 90 minutes and tell your colleagues that was the best 90 minutes I spent? So what should that agenda be? And you get some really interesting items to talk about, right? And when I set ground rules, I say, we're going to talk about anything you want to talk about, and I'm going to be pretty open and transparent. My expectation is they're going to be do the same. And so it gives you really good visibility to the folks they have and maybe where some of the gaps might exist.
It's great to hear you talk about creating a space for that, because even if people are presenting in an audit committee meeting, I think those meetings are tight in terms of time and perhaps scripted. And so
they're scripted, and you got management sitting in, for a big part of it. I mean, so this is perhaps a little different conversation, but I think it's one that's important.
That's great. Let's put the slide on internal audits, which Tony alluded to before. And Krista, now this was a question that we had in our survey, which is the second year we've had this question. And it's kind of good news, mostly good news. But like, the main question, but we talk about how can companies extract more value from internal audit? We say here that internal audit has a high level of understanding about the business, 89%. Plans are promptly updated, 86%. Is effective at assisting management and identifying new risks, 82%. But then could bring needed insights to stakeholders, 77%. But we also know that, and I feel like it maybe isn't on this slide, but there is a data point about could also bring more value, and that's a high percentage too.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, if you look at these four, clearly audit committees feel like internal audit's doing a great job in all of these areas, but then the number was 80, it's another 82%. 82% feel like there is an opportunity for internal audit to add more value. And maybe that's kind of a no-brainer, because I feel like you can always add more value, right? No matter how good you're doing. But the question then is, how do you do that? What do you want to do? And if you think about companies use internal audit in different ways. Some of them use internal audit more as a compliance group, and then others use them as more forward-looking, value-driven functions that are really strategic. And so when you start to think about how can you do that, it's trying to figure out how do you align them more to that forward-looking, value-driven function, and trying to get some of those strategic insights that can help with decision-making, they can help with risk management. And those are where you do start to see some of that value. And so, given those positive areas you see here, I feel like audit committees do clearly see the value. And if there is an interest in shifting or interest in getting even more value out of audit committees, out of internal audit, a couple things that I think they could think about is one that Tony definitely talked about is making sure there's alignment between the business strategy, between what internal audit is doing from a plan perspective, how it's integrated with ERM, addressing emerging risks. So really no daylight between strategy, ERM, and internal audit plans. Like those need to be super tightly aligned so that internal audit is really focusing on those right areas that are bringing value to the organization. A second area to think about from a value perspective is around communication and collaboration. So the way that the internal audit group communicates with the audit committee, with senior management, and that's through their reports. So clear, actionable audit reports, making sure that any issues that are reported are resolved timely, and that any of the recommendations that are reported out are implemented timely. And that's a partnership between the internal audit organization and the audit committee, making sure that that gets done. Technology, we've talked a little bit about that, but there are so many opportunities for internal audit from a technology standpoint. So the audit committee could really challenge the internal audit leader, the chief audit executive, about how are they using technology, especially if you think about you know, some of these continuous auditing techniques that will really help get more real-time data, better insights, and help you really respond much more quickly to emerging risks. So those are some questions you could be asking about. And then talent, you know, Karen talked a lot in the beginning, at the beginning of this section, just around the importance of talent and making sure that there is the right team. So the audit committee can ask those questions. Do you have the right skills and resources? As you think about technology and how that's changing, are you getting the right people? Do they have the right training to make sure that they can do what you need from an internal audit perspective? And do they have those advisory and consultative skills that are needed? And then putting that all together, it's that engagement and that interaction with the audit committee and making sure that the audit committee has proper oversight. And to Tony's point, very clear collaboration and direct access to the audit committee, and that the audit committee has a clear, strong support within the organization of the internal audit department and the internal audit leaders, so that management across the board can see that. So those are a few areas, I think, that if you think about how you could maybe move the needle a little bit from a value perspective, that you could think about doing some things.
Thanks. I hope we didn't lose Tony. I think, Tony, you're off camera, so maybe you just hit the stop video button by accident. While we're waiting for Tony to come back, Karen, we have there you are. Oh,
I'm back. I am back.
I did the same thing. I just
you get on the calls like this, and all of a sudden somebody's at the door, and it's like, okay.
I thought
so
you did
my
what
apologies.
I did. That's okay. Hit the button by accident. Well, Karen, we have a question in the Q&A that I thought I'd pose to you, and Tony, you can also weigh in. Now, there's an observation that internal audit, the problem with internal audit is that comp still has not risen to a level that's appropriate for the skills required today. That's a generalization, but that's this person's experience. Fair enough. So based on your roles, Karen, what is your perception of internal audit today, maybe for the boards that you're on?
The boards I'm on, our internal audit function is highly valued. And one of them, we just completed an external assessment to the new Institute of Internal Auditing Standards. And the firm that provided it said they were absolutely stunned to see how many positive comments there were about the internal audit function, about how they partner with the business, how they are invited to come and help solve particular problems, sort of more like an advisory, but they also do internal audit. Now, on the compensation thing, I mean, in the new Institute of Internal Auditing Standards, there's an explicit requirement that the audit committee must approve the budgets and must not, you know, or at least weigh in on the budgets for the internal audit function. And comp would certainly come up there. But I know on some of mine, you know, I have certainly challenged whether the person was adequate. The head and chief executive, audit executive, was compensated on similar to other people at the same level. And also advocated for promotion because of how well they're doing.
Yeah.
Great.
Can I just add a couple of comments?
Let's launch our polling results and
okay.
And our fourth poll. Just sorry, we can get it in, and then I'm going to come to you, Tony. So we're seeing across pretty equal full board audit committee, risk committee. So that's ERM. And let's launch our fourth polling question. And then, Tony, while we're doing that, please go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to add a couple things to what Karen shared. I've had the luxury of having some really good audit committee or internal audit groups, and I go to the leadership of the group. Is that leader a really high quality person? And if the answer is no, and the company doesn't address it, then that tells me a lot about how the company views internal audit. And to me, that's not positive. And so, I've been fortunate to have some really good ones. And then you can also see, particularly when you spend time with them, the way I've tried to, you can really see what that next line of people underneath the leader, just what the quality of those folks are. And so I think there was a day if you go back in the distant past, internal audit wasn't particularly valued. I think that but I think groups have come a long way and really upgrading the quality of the people that are in internal audit. Now on compensation, we get the surveys on compensation and the like to make sure we're in alignment. We know the compensation of the
market data.
Market data.
Yeah.
And we know what the company pays its people. The other thing that I actually weigh in on their evaluation. So the CFO and I will sit down and write that person's evaluation, and so that I feel really good about what's being communicated to the leader of internal audit. I've weighed in on it, and the like, and so. If you're sitting there and you don't have a particularly good internal audit group, or I think that's worth really digging into and really challenging the company as to whether or not they've taken it as seriously as they could. We have a number of people who come in from the businesses that participate in internal audit and vice versa, and so that's another kind of sign as to just how valued or how they're viewed throughout the organization. So my experience, has been pretty positive with respect to internal audit.
I mean, I feel like from my experience as an auditor before I came to the CAQ, I did see a mix, and I almost feel like saying if you're not an organization where internal audit is valued, I mean, easier said than done, but there are companies out there, I think, that can give you a good internal audit experience. Where internal audit is valued, and that's probably where you want to be.
Just one other thing. I'm sorry, Vanessa.
No, okay.
The other thing, because you can't have an internal audit, an expert for everything that you got to deal with, right? And so how you partner with resources outside the company to bring in expertise where needed is another important element in ensuring that they can exercise their responsibilities. And at least in my cases, we have some pretty good relationships that we bring, where we can bring in some people to help. I'd even put some pressure on the external auditors, because I have a very strong opinion about how external auditors come to the table and bringing the firm to the table when we're dealing with issues and the like, and how they step up in finding or resources within their organization to help the company or the audit committee address an issue. So anyway, I would add that as well, but this is one that we just can't lose sight of. Yeah.
So we only have a minute or two left. I did want to get to this question in the chat, which I thought we'd get to earlier than now. Krista, I'm just going to ask you quickly, when we put up the slide earlier about the changes and AI governance, I think slipped just a little bit. And so just looking, yeah, it did. What does that tell you? So does the somewhat low prioritization of AI suggest low implementation of those technologies within these specific environments? Can you quickly, 30 seconds?
No. Yeah, I don't think it does. I think it's, one of the things is we ask, as I mentioned at the beginning, first we ask who has oversights of this topic or this risk. And so if somebody said the audit committee doesn't have primary oversight, they would not have answered this question. And so I would first say that in general, I wouldn't say that the audit committee has primary oversight for AI. It's probably at the board level right now, with pieces of it being within the audit committee. I would just point you, Deloitte just released a publication. It's a strategic governance roadmap for AI that does lay out what do you need to do. I'm just going to hit on a couple quick things because this question comes up a lot. Fluency is important. Going back to even what Karen said about cyber, everybody can't be an expert, shouldn't be an expert, but you need to be fluent to know what questions to ask. So figure out how to get smart on the topic. And then the couple things to think about, you need to understand the opportunities at your organization as an audit committee. What are the opportunities? What are we doing today? What could we be doing? Ask questions about that. and then understand the risk. So you need to think about both sides, the opportunity side and the risk side, and then think about the governance structure. So how is your board overseeing AI? And it's probably in a couple different areas. There's probably certain things that the audit committee is overseeing. Happy to chat offline with anybody if you want to talk a little bit more about that, but also just take a look at that report because it does have some pretty good information in there about how to oversee AI from a board perspective.
Awesome. Let's do a lightning round. I know we're a little bit over time. So how about Karen, Tony, Krista? What is a key takeaway for our audience today? Karen, starting with you.
My key takeaway to the audience would be whether you're an audit committee member or an internal audit person, are you leading? What you're doing, leading practices or lagging? And I would not be afraid to challenge or change.
Great. Tony?
I guess the big takeaway is the world is awfully dynamic today. Executive orders that we brought up earlier is only one example of that. And my God, everybody has to be pretty darn dynamic to keep up with it. But that's what we're dealing with today.
Krista.
Okay, I'm gonna build off. This is perfect. I'm gonna build off both of you because this is a term I heard recently from a client. And it's around just this environment we're in today. We couldn't even get through what we have on our list, which we thought we would have extra time, but it's ruthless prioritization. You have to be ruthless about what you put on your agenda and what you talk about, because otherwise you are not going to get to the topics that are really most important and most pressing for your organization today.
I love that. Ruthless prioritization. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. It's been a great discussion as always. And thank you to our participants. Hope everyone has a great rest of your day. And that's it for now. Thank you.